Welcome to the Transformation series on Eternal Paradigm. In this series, you will hear stories from people who have transformed their lives. Have you worked out what your life's purpose is yet? What makes you tick? Are you living a fulfilled life? What is your calling? Are you actually listening?
I accidentally became a person in remission. I didn't even think it was such a big deal until I realized that I am an Asian woman in remission. And if I don't talk about my condition, then there's a woman sitting in the same room as me who's potentially a diabetic who doesn't know that there's something you can do about it.
Welcome to the Eternal Paradigm Transformation series. Hello, welcome to the fourth and final episode of the Transformation series, and I am really hoping that you have enjoyed all of the episodes and that you will also listen to this one. I guess ultimately, the whole point of the podcast and the episodes is to really get you to think, but not only to think with your mind, because that's just one aspect of you, but to really think with your mind, body, and the voice inside you, whether you call that your soul or whether you call that your true authentic self, whatever that may be, it's to get you to think on all of those levels. This episode is also, it's an open conversation with an incredibly strong woman who I am in awe of her. Ever since I have met her, she's just incredible. She's this incredible energy who is battling her own demons, who is an absolute warrior. So Shivali Modha is, I call her the Accidental Remissionist, because you will hear in her story the heartache that she's been through when she realized that her mind, her body, cultural expectations, lifestyle, everything that she thought and knew to be normal or okay kind of came to an abrupt shift, one that she wasn't ready for, one that she totally was not expecting, but it happened. She was diagnosed with type 2 diabetes shortly after finding out that she was pregnant with her first baby. This episode does have topics that some may find difficult to hear. However, if you are able to, it's definitely worth listening to how this remarkable woman and her husband have actually come through to the other side. And with that in mind, I'd like to introduce my next guest.
Hello, my name is Shivali Modha from Northwest London. I live in the northwest of London with my in-laws, my husband and my two daughters. Before that, I lived in the southwest of London, and that's where I grew up with my mum, dad, sisters and my grandparents. I am a type 2 diabetic in remission since 2018, having been a diabetic for 11 years. I was initially diagnosed with type 2 diabetes in my first pregnancy, and it wasn't something that I had anticipated happening. I went in for a routine antenatal checkup, and my blood sugars were really high. When I saw the nurse, her face kind of fell and she was quite ashen from seeing how high my blood sugar was and for the fact that I was pregnant. At the time, I hadn't realised what a big deal it was to have high blood sugars in pregnancy. And it wasn't until my GP, who saw my result and told me how catastrophic it could be in pregnancy, I just hadn't got that recognition of just how bad it is. I have diabetes in the family, so it's not that I was unaware of complications of diabetes, but I hadn't realised just how dangerous it can be in pregnancy. Now, one day I was as normal and the next day I was diabetic. It was as simple as that. I walked in to the surgery as a non-diabetic person, and within hours I was told that I was type 2, that I needed to be on oral medication, but I also needed to take injections in order to protect my pregnancy. when they told me this, I entirely blamed myself. I thought it must be something I've done. It's my bad karma. It's from this life or another. I'm paying for something that I must have done. I blamed everything. I blamed everything on, it must be my fault. You know, this diagnosis must be something that I had done wrong. And now, because of me, the life of my unborn child was at risk. And to be honest, I was ashamed, to tell anybody, and I was scared. A young, soon to be mum, all that excitement and the idea that I would have all these cravings and I'd go and eat all these lovely foods and I'd be, for the first time in my life, I'd be allowed to eat those things, and for it all to be very quickly a bit of a dream away, that kind of safe, healthy pregnancy and everyone looking after you and making you nice things to eat. That didn't happen because I had to put so many restrictions into place and it wasn't what we were expecting, Unfortunately, I did lose that pregnancy, and despite controlling my blood sugars and taking extra precautions and all those sorts of things, I was unfortunate to lose the baby in that pregnancy. And just as all these exciting plans that we'd made, my husband and I, was completely squashed, I think any woman in that position, on discovering that the condition that they have is the reason why their child isn't in this world, you carry a lot of guilt with that, a lot of blame. We were fortunate to have a lot of support from the hospital, who immediately put me on folic acids, and my husband and I were certain that we wanted to conceive again and we were going to make preparations for this. I quickly realized that if we were going to try and conceive, then I needed to stay on insulin and take control of my blood sugars. And we did that. So I did continue to take insulin right through conception to having my firstborn. But it all became very mechanical. You know that when you're conceiving for the first time and it's just something natural and normal and it happens and everyone's very excited. But this time we treaded carefully and fearful that it might happen again. And, we're quite fortunate here that the NHS system is so good that they did repeated scans for us. They helped throughout the pregnancy. They did, I was referred to a dietitian who helped explain the best way to, with my vegetarian diet, be able to manage my carbs and look at things like glycemic index and which foods to eat in combination with other foods, and completely rethink the way that I ate and managed my food. I think I lost weight in my pregnancies, for both my pregnancies since, and I managed to control my blood sugars throughout. Diabetic pregnancy and labour is, for want of a better term, is quite chaotic. Even when you go into labour, it's not a normal labour. I needed to be induced because it's a high-risk pregnancy, and the induction process is not very nice. It is hell, Your body is put through the extremes of labour, and each contraction is like 1,000 folds more painful than a normal contraction, is what I've read. And I did feel like I'd been to hell and back.
That sounds so intense. And there's so much there, because you mentioned guilt, which is a lot of pressure, and also the fact that you felt wholly responsible for this. That's incredibly, just listening to you say it, I can feel my mouth is going dry. I'm actually getting a lump in my throat, because I can hear from your experience how tumultuous the whole experience has been.
But Ori,
yes, go for it.
When you realise that your desire for good food killed your child, that's the guilt that I lived with for a long time, that for the simple pleasures of good food, and that the luxury of good food was the reason that my child wasn't in this world. And it was the reason that there was upset everywhere, and why people looked at me with their eyes full of sorrow, pity, call it pity. And unfortunately for me, in our culture, we have this thing where for the first 12 weeks, we don't tell anybody that we're pregnant, because just in case something like this happens, at least you're protected from prying eyes and people sort of, it's quite a big taboo, miscarriage, in the Asian culture, in the South Asian culture. And it continues to be for many women a taboo subject. And I remember my mum saying, don't tell anybody you're pregnant. And we didn't. We did it by the book. We didn't tell anybody. And unfortunately, it was literally the day that we announced it. Like literally on one side, my mum's made the phone calls to everybody, my uncles and my aunties, all excited, that they're going to have their first grandchild. Everyone was so happy. And in the other room, there I am in the throes of a miscarriage. I can't begin to explain that feeling of having let everyone down, and then that pity that everybody looks at you with. And it's not something that you can control. It's not something that you had any control over at all. At that point in time, when that miscarriage was happening, it was already too late. There was nothing I could have done. And I didn't have that option of, finding out I was diabetic a few years earlier and taking control of my health and reading up or planning. It was literally being thrown into the eye of a hurricane and losing everything in that moment, including my faith and belief. And, if there is a God, why would God do this? The whole world is laughing at me because I couldn't even protect this baby, that I couldn't even protect this baby for 12 weeks, let alone 9 months. And it was entirely my fault. I blamed myself, but I also cursed myself repeatedly for not being able to do what normal women can do on a daily,
Yeah, that's a lot of pressure. And you were living with that, and your own internal dialogue with yourself was incredibly dense. I'm going to ask you how did you change that? How did you change that internal dialogue? And what was your process?
I don't think that internal dialogue and that conflict, the two conscious minds, the good, the bad on the shoulder, there was that constant battle just carried on and on and on. And it was only so my firstborn was 6 months old when I lost my father to heart disease and diabetes. And I had seen his journey with diabetes, and I'd seen my journey. And unfortunately, regrettably, he'd seen my journey with diabetes in pregnancy. And that pain that was in my eyes echoed in his, because he knew what I was going through. And I'd finally learned now what he had always gone through with his diabetes. The irony of life is that as I was bringing my firstborn into the world, he was slowly losing his life. And watching him die in front of my eyes with this condition was showing me the mirror, showing me what my tomorrows were going to be, and showing me also that this isn't what I wanted for my children. This is not what I wanted for the child that I'd brought into this world after so much, to be the mirror image of me waiting in a hospital with me on that deathbed and her at my feet. That isn't what I wanted. And I think that was the point in my life where I really scrutinized where I was going to go, what direction I was going to take. But at the same time, sort of losing my dad is and was the worst thing that could ever happen. It was the end of my world in so many ways. And it felt as if every time I took my baby into my arms and fed her at my bosom and gave her life, his was slowly being taken away. And there are so many points in those 6 months where I felt as if, if there is a God was showing me that this is life. You choose to give birth and have a baby, but at the same time, someone else's life is seeping away. And that was my dad. I feel as if I questioned everything in those days, in those moments. And I can see the sort of ticking of the clock and those moments as they passed by. how my whole philosophy on life was ever changing, you know?
Mm-hmm.
It was like I was being taught a lesson, but without any books. I was being taught that this is what can happen and this is where you're going, this is where you're heading
Mm.
if you don't take charge of your life. But I think even then, at that point, I don't think that I had the tools to make these changes or to even think about dealing with my health. I was grieving, I was a young mum, and very much just kind of in a busy young mum back to work. And I don't think I took the lessons then as I should have. And it was only in my second, when my second child was born, and I almost lost my life giving birth to my second born because of complications with my blood sugars, and I lost a lot of blood, and it was very, very messy. It was that point, I think, really where it changed, where I suddenly, all the pieces of the puzzle came together when I saw that light in that room. And it was the difference between life and death, and knowing that if I come out of this room, of this operation theatre alive, then something's got to change. And that's something that changes has to be me. I'm sure that, women go through pregnancies, and you've been through pregnancies and you've been through diabetes in pregnancy. And I'm sure we share some of these fears and experiences. Would you say that's right?
Yes, yes, very much. I mean, again, my story, I guess, is I had gestational diabetes in my first pregnancy. Then went on to have 4 miscarriages. One was almost an ectopic pregnancy, which resulted in immense blood loss. And then I went on to have my son, and that had its own story. And then I was fortunate enough to go and have my third child, but I had many complications and ended up in an operating theatre with that light.
Wow.
So yeah, I know exactly the words you're saying, and
They take you
like
back.
I said, yeah, I feel. What's interesting though is I, within myself, have made peace with it, but my body still has memories. And
Yeah.
I'm very fortunate enough, I should say, to be at this place in my life at this point where I'm able to understand and help my body heal. And, our bodies, exactly like you said, go through so much and they hold on to so much, because our brains are wired that way. So our brain will hold on to anything that's hurt us. So even if it's negative words, negative emotions, and it will hold on to it for dear life because it's a survival instinct, the irony of it. And so when I sit here and I listen to your story, I'm feeling the pain in my body because my body remembers, even though I have made my peace with it.
I can understand that, because
Yeah.
even every time I have this conversation or try to speak about these experiences, I feel it in my body, and it drains you when you take yourself back into that headspace that you were in at that point. I can feel the weight of my pregnant body, or my no longer pregnant body, or my bleeding body, or my dying body. I feel like I haven't come to terms with a lot of what happened, because I never grieved for that young lady who wasn't diabetic and, living a normal life. I never grieved for my dad. I never grieved for my baby. I never gave myself that chance to take stock and stop, because even now I feel like I don't. I hold on to it because it fuels my resilience. It fuels my battle with myself. It fuels my daily run. It pushes me to make the right choices. It pushes me to the limits. The physical limits and trauma that labor and pregnancy push you to. I'm able to push myself to those physical limits because I hold on to the nuances of those moments. Does that make sense?
Absolutely. That does. But it's like it's the fuel that guides you to make those better informed choices to become who you want to be or who you need to be.
And the fear of going backwards. It's just as easy with being a diabetic. I will always be a diabetic, whether I'm in remission or not. I know that this condition is my friend for life now. And either I can feed it all the great things that it needs to be stable and controlled, or I can completely undo all of my efforts within minutes. It wouldn't take much to push me over the limit even now. And like anybody who's a foodie, I'm a proper emotional eater. And given half a chance, I'd be right back
With
there
you.
again taking injections.
Yes. Yeah. And emotional eating is something I totally, totally understand. What I would like to know, if you're willing to share, is so when those nuances fuel you and your choices, I understand that on some level. But when it comes to grief and grieving, that's another really big, normal human emotion that sometimes is not kind of culturally allowed or accepted. And then we put this pressure on ourselves to get on with it. I'm interested to know about your grieving journey or process. And are you allowing yourself to grieve?
I don't think I can ever allow myself to grieve, because the minute it's like a pressure cooker. Even if I release a little bit of that steam, I feel like I'm going to blow, because the gas stove and that heat is still as strong now as it ever was. And if I'm going to release this pressure, I feel like I'm going to damage myself and anybody else who's near me. And I feel like it's not the right time. I always feel like it's not the right time, and that's probably not the most healthy way of dealing with grief. Across my time, I've had many medics say to me that I should think about some sort of counselling, or, just kind of deal with all the things that life has kind of thrown at me in the last 20 years or so. But I'm kind of okay with it. I've made peace with the fact that I'm in this grieving process and I'm in this denial process. And I watch my siblings grieve, and I watch my mum, and I watch others grieve in a very natural, normal kind of way. But I feel like if I either turn down that heat or release all that pressure, there's nothing to drive the force which kind of propels me on a daily to get out of bed, go for my run, go, make healthy food, teach my children about healthy food, and really push this message out to young women, young Asian women, that this condition is something that will affect your life if you don't look after it and yourself. And I don't want my children to live with the shame, I think, that I've lived with, which came with my diabetes. I feel like I've never done anything shameful. This happened to me and it is full of shame. And I don't want that for other young women. I want other young women to find the strength to deal with conditions like diabetes or depression, or the whole array of conditions which affect us that we don't speak about in our culture, in our communities, that we don't voice or deal with. And I feel like my grief is my friend. And I think that we're very quick to try to come to terms with things like grief, and it's often seen as quite a negative emotion that needs to be dealt with straight away, or, I don't know what's going to happen. Something's going to happen. I don't feel that.
Oh, right.
I feel quite comfortable in my grief. If I wish to cry with my grief, I'll cry. But I don't feel that I've done that for normality, So like when we talk about grief in the big term of losing people, I feel like I hold that close. And then when it comes to grieving for, I'll explain. So now that we're all in lockdown, children quite often have treats and creams, and so waffles and ice creams and indulgence. I don't do those things, but there was a time that I would have been the front runner of that gang who orders the triple chocolate waffle syrup. So I miss that girl. I miss being that spontaneous, extra large pizza eating girl. And I wish that my girls had met her because she was fun and she could really eat and enjoyed her food. And I feel like I'm one of these nagging mums who's constantly say, if you're going to eat that, you better go for a run. You better do some dancing if you're going to be eating that chocolate ice cream cake thing. I feel like a real rubbish mum.
I don't think that's rubbish. I think that's making them aware that if you are going to eat this, your body's most natural state is to move. I think sometimes we think too much of ourselves as humans, and one of our most, food is amazing and it's great that we can eat that, but keeping our bodies moving and healthy is more of a vital thing more than anything. So I don't think that makes you a rubbish mum. I think that makes you a mum who's informing her children of...
A bit like what we were saying when we spoke previously about how, as we were growing up, the culture was so different.
Oh, so much,
And
yes.
these were not conversations that we had with our parents. And actually, it was quite normal. Even food and indulgence and excess was quite normal for that generation of South Asians who came into this country and worked hard. They enjoyed hard. They worked hard and they had fun and they ate great food. And these weren't conversations that I recall having. I'm sure you didn't have conversations around food or diet growing up, potentially.
Yes.
I think as well, it takes the joy out of parenting because I very much feel like that my husband's very much able to indulge with them and they have a different relationship. Not that they're gluttonous by any means, but I wonder if I'd be a different mum if I wasn't a diabetic mum. And as much as my children understand my journey, when I had my eldest, it was really uncanny. If I ever had a hypo in the night, she would cry before the hypo was at its peak, even as a baby, right? When she was in my stomach, in my womb, she would kick me before my hypo was at its peak. And that would tell me that my blood sugars were about to dip. And that carried on for the first few years of her life, just this instinctive bond that we had. And she would know that before I knew that my blood sugars were about to dip. And my children have very much seen that journey of me taking injections. I mean, in 2018, when my diabetes was at its worst, I was studying for exams on office job. I wasn't running. I had broken my pinky toe. Who'd think a pinky toe would stop you from running? I couldn't
It
run.
does. I've had the same. A broken pinky.
It's
No good.
horrible.
Yeah.
And I couldn't run. And in that year, my blood sugar was so high. So they watched me injecting these really big injections. It's called Biduron, and it's a weekly thing. But it's the size of a donkey's tail. You shake that for an hour, and then you take it, and then it leaves you with golf ball size kind of wounds and welts on your stomach. But they've seen all that. They've seen my journey. And I always feel like they've seen it, so they understand it. But actually they don't. And I think there are times as they grow where now that I'm in remission and I'm not taking injections, it's less of a reality. Mummy is diabetic, but it's really well controlled. So surely everyone can control their diabetes is kind of, I think, what they're growing up with. But I think they forget that journey of coming through the other end. And I worry that if I end up on injections again, how they cope with that, how they would cope with, or if God forbid, something were to happen where through nothing of their doing, if either of them were to become diabetic, how they might cope with it.
Yeah. So I'm going to ask you another question, which is this: if you could explain, what does remission mean?
Yeah.
And what did you do for the remission to actually happen?
Sure. So remission in diabetes is when your HbA1c is a normal HbA1c and you are able to stop medication, diabetic medication. That could mean that you could in future need to take medication again. It does still mean that your ability to process sugar is compromised, and that could be further compromised in times of stress or sickness. And for me, remission happened by accident. I set out to lose weight because I couldn't run. I took control of my diet and I went low GI, but I also went low fat. I massively increased my protein. So I set myself a ratio. A third of my plate would be protein, a third would be complex carbs, and the other third would be salads or fruit in moderation. And I lost in total around 3 stone. But from my highest weight to my current weight, I've lost a total of 7 stone. And losing that weight, and in particular, in specific, losing the fat from your organs can help your pancreas to cope with your blood sugars better and to be able to consume the sugar in a more efficient way. That is remission. And very much they're finding nowadays, there's lots of research and trials taking place where they're saying that if you are a type 2 diabetic and you have been recently diagnosed, then it is possible to go into remission. And one of the things they suggest you do is consult with a medical practitioner who will guide you through a low calorie diet and low carb diet. But there is a lot of research saying that if you can do that straight away on diagnosis, then you have a better long-term prognosis with your diabetes. Obviously, with diabetes, the complications aren't just like in pregnancy and things. I have some eye issues. I have some other issues as well, which affect my body, and they're a legacy of being diabetic for such a long time. Others are affected in their limbs, in their organs, kidney, liver, heart, eyes, are all things, feet, peripheral parts of your body, that can all be impacted by diabetes. But research suggests that going into remission, but not even trying to get into remission, if you can just improve your lifestyle, your diet, and control your blood sugars better right at the very beginning when you're diagnosed, then the long-term prognoses are better in most individuals. I accidentally became a person in remission, and in 2018, 2019, I didn't even think it was such a big deal, if I'm honest, until I realized that I am an Asian woman in remission who for a long time has lived with this condition. And if I don't talk about my condition, then there's a woman sitting in the same room as me who's potentially a diabetic who hasn't spoken to me and doesn't know that there's something you can do about it. So very much in the last year or so, I gave myself a voice. I allowed myself a voice. And initially, when I said to my mum that this is what I intend to do, I intend to speak about my experiences, there was a reluctance, and she accepts there was a reluctance for me to do that, because I just want you to understand the extent to which this was a shame. You know, I'm the eldest of 4. There's 3 sisters and a brother. My extended family, for the 11 and a half years that I was diabetic, did not know I was diabetic. That's my uncles on my dad's side. That's my auntie on my dad's side. That's my aunties on my mum's side and my uncles on my mum's side. And we're a close-knit family. I met my family on so many occasions and could have been very much going through a very bad time with my blood sugars, but no one would have known. You know, like at my brother's wedding, I was very unwell. I was very, very unwell, and my blood sugars were very, very bad, but nobody knew. So there was none of this care that comes with knowing. Do you see what I mean? And then when I said to my mum that I'm going to be talking to the world about this, her first instinct was to say, "Are you sure, Shivali, this is maybe not a good idea? Your grandparents don't know, your aunties and uncles don't know, and now you're going to talk to the world."
Oh, okay. Yeah.
Against all of her wishes, I gave my first interview and I published my first blog about being a South Asian woman who is diabetic and is in remission, because I needed to open that dialogue. I needed to do it for every woman before me who had diabetes and didn't say anything, and for every woman after me who will be diagnosed, because South Asians have the highest rates of diabetes, for every young woman who is going to be diagnosed after me and could experience what I did.
That's a brave move, and I'm truly grateful that you've done this because I don't think diabetes is talked about enough, and all the different connecting factors. So there's a big story around the genetic side of this. And you talked about the genetics, the ethnic background. So yes, South Asian people and people of Black, I
BME.
can't even say ethnic minorities, BME, yes, exactly. So, are at higher risk. And miscarriage and diabetes are the two things that potentially don't get talked about.
It would just make me laugh, or me. Like I used to say to my mom, go to a wedding, go to any Indian wedding, and you'll find that Asian women are following their husbands around saying, oh no, he needs to eat. He's diabetic. He needs to take his medicine. I never ever saw an Asian man do the same for his wife. And actually, if you go to any Asian wedding, keep an eye. And I did this because I just used to find it fascinating. If you keep an eye on that line, which goes from the ladies' toilets,
Yes.
and it stretches into the dinner queue, you'll
Yeah.
see that every woman is watching her handbag and has her injection in there, and nobody knows.
Oh, that's
right?
insane.
It used to fascinate me, and I would wonder how many of those women that went into the loos before me had just taken an injection or was about to take one. Isn't that just crazy?
Oh,
why
gosh.
is it that it's okay for that Asian man to be looked after so
Yes.
much? Bless him, he's diabetic and he needs to eat. Where I, as a woman, couldn't even voice it that I need to eat. I'm pregnant and I'm diabetic and I need to eat.
Gosh.
I couldn't even say that. Did you have any times like that where you felt like, I need to say something? I need to be able to say, no, I need to look after me.
Yeah. I mean, yeah. To be fair, I had diabetes in my first pregnancy, first successful pregnancy. And there were times where I was like shaking. And at that point, because I had come from a family where diabetes was like, I mean, if you didn't have diabetes after your name, like the initials, you weren't really part of a club sort of thing. And so everyone, my dad, all his brothers, my grandmother, all but two of my dad's sisters, everyone is diabetic. Oh, my dad's youngest brother might not be. And we grew up in sweet shops as well.
We had a shop too. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And, and for my dad, it was normal to have like not one Snickers bar. And this is back in the day when they were called marathons and they were big. And he'd have about 2 or 3. And so I used to watch this thinking, oh, okay, cool. But it just never really dawned on me that my family who were there, who were looking after our basic needs, were very ill-equipped and ill-informed when it came to fully understand how to nourish their bodies and to stay healthy. And I've got some horrific examples in the family of where diabetes has taken over and resulted in so many physical ailments. So, devastating physical, just, horrific examples. And that was what I grew up with firsthand. So for me, I got to in my early 20s and I thought, okay, diabetes, need to check this. Need to make sure that it's something I don't get. Because for me, all of my family examples were at extremes. No one was living with it and managing it or avoiding it. And it was only when I got to, I think, it must have been mid-20s. And I was diagnosed with polycystic ovaries. And there's a connection with polycystic ovaries and diabetes. And it has lots of different things. So by this point, I've got polycystic ovaries. At this point, even though at that point, the blood tests that you were talking about hadn't been it wasn't out here so much in the UK, but they were doing it in the States. So by the time I got to maybe 26, 27, close, getting married, I'm thinking about diabetes for myself, but I'm looking at my husband because I'm seeing that he's showing signs. Now, in his family, no one had diabetes. So when I'm looking at him and I'm seeing familiar signs that I recognize, and yet we'd been married a year and he was diagnosed with diabetes, I was kicking myself because I knew that. But had I said that to him, he wouldn't have listened to me. So that was quite a big shock for him, and all the challenges that come with that. So at this point, I am on a range of different treatments for my polycystic ovaries, endometriosis. My husband's been diagnosed with diabetes. I'm of the mind that my body is not going to do what it needs to. Conceiving probably isn't going to happen. And then, lo and behold, I do become pregnant, but his diabetes is off the wall. And I'm in constant stress stations because I'm going, dude, I've seen what this can do to you. But because he had no knowledge of it, he didn't understand the severity of it. And I was up against this. And it was quite horrible. So when I got gestational diabetes and my blood sugar levels were everywhere, then they kept telling me every 10 minutes my baby was too big. Oh, we don't know if this pregnancy is going to be okay for you. And all this stuff. And again, I turned to myself. I didn't actually want to say to anyone that this was going on because of exactly what you're talking about. The shame, the advice, that you haven't done things properly, or maybe don't say anything. It's too much pressure.
And this idea that other people won't understand. I don't need people to need people to know that I'm not well.
Yes.
Because that's what it is, right? It's not, I don't want anybody's pity or sympathy, but if I'm sat down for 5 minutes, or if I don't look happy about something, or if I don't help clear the table up, it's not because I'm a moody pregnant woman, it's because I'm not well. And I think observers, people who have watched you in that situation at that time, probably didn't quite understand why you were behaving in a certain way. When you should be happy, you're pregnant, and this is supposed to be a joyful time. Why is she being stroppy, or why is she being,
Yeah.
And it's interesting you say that, because for Asian men as well, of that generation, of our generation, there's such bravado, such macho menism. They don't understand the consequence. I don't think my father understood the consequences either. He was the same, eating bars of chocolate.
That was my dad. That was
But
Sorry,
understand it. They didn't understand it.
No. I mean, I think even a week before before my dad passed away, when I was, with him, he was eating ice cream. It was all about ice cream. Oh, just anything. And again, sitting here now reflecting, I do wonder how much my dad himself was an emotional eater, and the convenience of having a sweet shop just kind of helped, or didn't help.
It was efficient because they were in the country, they were trying to make a living, and it was easy to grab what they could, then stop, go to the cash and carry, grab what you can, get back to the shop, grab what you can. And I honestly feel that it was much more a convenience thing and a sacrifice. I feel like my parents sacrificed their health to build a future for us. And they didn't understand that this has consequences. And actually, I think there must have been occasions when my dad was maybe eating chocolate because he was having a hypo. But me, the indignant daughter, would be like, why are you eating chocolate? You're diabetic. Until I had my first hypo and I sat in front of the junk food drawer and demolished it in one sitting, because my heart was jumping through my chest and I was sweating a bucket and my blood sugar was 1.8 or something stupid,
Oh, that's really low.
When you don't understand maybe that they are experiencing that. Or maybe we didn't know that that's what they were dealing with. That's what kind of I told myself afterwards, that maybe he was eating those 3 bars of chocolate or whatever at that point in time because he was dealing with something physical that I couldn't see or understand at the time. Maybe,
No, absolutely. That makes sense.
But as well, I feel cheated that this diabetes, call it what you will, ravages lives. My dad was a young man when I lost him. And as much as I blame myself for my condition, I used to blame him for his. But I feel like I've reconciled that in my heart, that if he really truly understood this condition, if there was true knowledge out there, if there was true sharing of experiences, maybe, just maybe, he wouldn't have been as bad as he was or as sick as he was. If there was more acceptance of the condition, if people had conversations around how to better your health, if that generation hadn't made the choices that they did to sacrifice their good health for the older generation and for the younger generation in providing for us. Maybe if they prioritize themselves, which is my first and final lesson to my children all the time, that your health is important and you must make time for it. Our parents didn't. Our parents just never did. I regret that in a big way.
Yeah, definitely. It's a sore point. Definitely a sore point. Like you say, how you've got your driver to kind of keep you going. My parents' ability to neglect themselves and yet devote themselves to everything else but themselves is a big driver for me. That's what gets me out of bed in the morning, because I am still traumatized by watching my mum die the way that she did. I'm still traumatized knowing that I watched my dad kill himself every day just by the choices that he made. And I don't want that for my children ever. You know, if they're going to have that experience, I'm not going to be the one to teach them that. Because afterwards, now living as an adult, as a child to my parents, it's hard. It's hard. I'm going to move on if that's okay.
I'm going to just say, I understand. I do understand. And, you know, we are the products of our upbringing. And I completely concur. I do not want for my children to walk in my footsteps and to see me in the way that I saw him, for your children to see you in the way you saw your parents. Because, you know, the tragedy is that it was all for the better good. Everything that they did was well intended, you know? It was always well intended. And it's sad. It's so sad. And I can only hope and pray that conversations like ours will mean that our daughters, our sons, and those like them will have at least a new story for them, at least a new version of how life can be, right?
Absolutely.
And it hurts because you know they had choices. It hurts.
Yeah.
That's the bit that hurts.
Remember, finding you really does matter.